Hello everyone. Today I want to discuss Deeptesh Sen's book, his recently published book of poems. As you can see here, absolutely beautiful it looks. It's called House of Song. This book has been published by Writers' Workshop, the famous and historic Writers' Workshop initiated by none other than Professor P. Lal and now taken care of by Professor Anandolal. Uh, as many of you would know, this particular collective has been instrumental in developing the canon of Indian English literature, Indian English poetry, and there's a field defining debate, in fact, between Buddhadev Boshu and Professor P. Lal on this when Buddhadev Boshu reviewed Professor Lal's anthology of Indian English literature and Professor Lal wrote back to him. There's a very famous debate there between vernacularism and Indian English literature. And this has been a long drawn debate, in fact. The central question of this debate being, should an Indian writer qualify himself or herself as Indian if he or she doesn't write in one of the Indian languages, the mother tongue, so to speak, of that particular writer? Now, there are authors who have always felt that, rather in a rather regimented way, they have felt that one has to write in one of the Indian languages to be qualified as an Indian writer. For example, someone like Shodhipan Chattopadhyay made this argument against the Indian English literary canon. But on the other hand, there is a massive post-colonial argument for writing back in the language of the colonizer and also shifting the terrain of that language from a cultural and political perspective. That has gone on to define and in many ways distinguish the Indian English literary canon from the various vernacular traditions. Deeptesh Sen's book is very interesting in this particular historical context because it's a book of poems that doesn't directly go into cultural utterance. This is not to say that there is no culture-specific statement here. There are. In fact, there are very interesting transcultural moments throughout these set of poems. But having said that, it's not a book which talks about Indian English poetry in a very specific culturalized fashion, the way the vogue is at the moment. It's a very interesting book in that particular balance, the balance it strikes between universal poetic utterance, which transcends the specificity of culture, and specific cultural moments that are produced in these poems. These are very interesting poems from the point of view of literary tradition, thus, and the balance that I've been talking about so far between the Indian English and the vernacular literary traditions. One can trace influences of both Romanticism and modernism in this poetry, but it's a very interesting balance again between Romanticism and modernism, between the lilt of Romanticism, the lyricism of Romantic poetry on the one hand, and on the other, the very sharp observational quality of a distant modernist voice that looks at things from a certain perspective of distance and indifference. Following T.S. Eliot, we could call this some sort of an observational poetry, a poetry of observations. But as I've been arguing, these observations are not merely cultural. They go beyond the cultural to delve into the philosophical, the introspective, the universal utterances of a subject, a speaking subject. Now, poetry in many ways has always been associated with certain terms like imagination, like fantasy, like passion, emotion. A more theoretically sophisticated name would be affect, which is not exactly reducible to emotion. Affect has to do with sensations, has to do with the way we feel various feelings in our body. And affect, I think, is a very interesting hook to think about in this book, because in many ways these poems come back again and again to one of the central affects of laughter. Is laughter an affect? Is it a bodily act? Is it language? What kind of effect does it have on the body? How does it reflect on observation? Because laughter, when it is coupled with observation, creates a sense of critical and sometimes even satirical distance. And this distance, this idea of distance, I think, is very important in this book, because it checks the romantic lyricism which is there otherwise. There are specific references to particular cities and timescapes and so on, but there's also a certain undefined, mysterious quality about these poems. They do not necessarily refer to specific locales. And sometimes when they do, for example, there's a poem in this book on Calcutta, there's a very interesting tracing of the city, as it were, and what emerges is the city of the night, the city of ghosts, and how the past of Calcutta keeps haunting its present. These are urban utterances. I don't think there is any doubt about the fact that these are urban utterances, and in that urban quality, there's an urban nostalgia as well that these poems trace in the modernist context. There's no romantic return to nature or that kind of tendency in these poems. But what really struck me as a reader was the philosophical depth of some of these lines. In fact, I would say the city is one of those recurrent motifs in this book. So is laughter, so are the ghosts who throng the shadowy landscape of this city. For example, the book opens with these lines: "The city has no face that I can call mine, this time has no end that I can measure, her silence has no name that I can remember." In many poems in this book, there's the central tool of apostrophe, which is an address to the other. And it's interesting how this other who is evoked and addressed by the poet, by the voice of the poet, is shifting between two pronominal structures, one being you, the second person pronoun, the other being her, the third person pronoun. And there's a constant shift between these two pronouns. And the shift also speaks of distance, how intimate the you is and how observationally distant the her is. Poetry, if we may try and define the medium from the vantage of these poems, is a call towards the other. It's a prayer for communication. It's a desire to communicate with the other. But at the same time, these poems are beautifully preoccupied with the medium of this call, with the vehicle of this addressal. And the vehicle in this case is speech. And throughout this book, there are various spectral images Deeptesh deploys to talk about speech. The grave of speech, he calls it at one point, the tomb of speech at another. So at various levels, he is deeply aware of the deadness of language, language as a dead medium, as it were. And that's something that shapes these poems quite beautifully. There are these recurrent images of music, but music doesn't simply harmonize. Music also creates moments of disturbance throughout this book of poems. For example, the solitude that Deeptesh characterizes this house of song with is a deeply moving solitude that disturbs us as well. It's not just about music as harmony, but it's also about music as disturbance. And then there is the satirically distant laughter, which is also gloomy in moments, sad and melancholic in others. And this laughter almost asks a question about the limits of language. Music and laughter, one can argue about this book, offer two ways of thinking about the limits of language. And Deeptesh, throughout these poems, is deeply aware, sometimes even problematically aware of this limit, the limit of language, the limit of utterance. And again, the question rings back to us whether we should consider laughter to be language. Laughter, which is a much more bodily act, as it were, than what we consider language to be, speech to be. The element of technology, again, becomes a very interesting trope. There are poems that talk about the banalization that happens through technology, the digital copies of the self and the other that banalize a relationship as well. How the body loses its meaning in our virtual world. Towards the end of this book, there's a beautiful poem which talks about the fall of body, the fall of the human body from meaning. So, what I would say here is that these are poems with a great deal of contemplative, reflective depth. And there's an attempt to use poetry to think, to further philosophical thinking, conceptual thinking, and not just cultural thinking. However, there are these, as I tried to address at the beginning, there are these beautifully culturalized moments as well. For example, the female figure evoked in some of these poems is named Ashiana, and Ashiana seems to hover around the tomb of Don Giovanni. Of course, the musical reference taken care of, this is a beautiful moment of intercultural communication where Ashiana meets Don Giovanni. And it's a very interesting moment, I thought. Various kinds of mythologies have been used throughout this poem, throughout this book, and there's also, one of the poems, as I was saying, which deals with the geographical landscape in its geopolitical detailing, is this poem called Stagnation, which is on Kolkata. There's also a lot of work here on various affective acts like mourning and so on. So again, that is something to think about. There's a good deal of metapoetic metaphors in this book. Death of the Poem is the title of one of the poems, and very often we have these images where a poem is evoked within the poem in an imagistic context. So Ashiana, my love, my child of sand and light at the tomb of Giovanni is this beautiful image from the poem Fall. There's also this idea that laughter builds itself into a position of indifference. But laughter also carries within itself a deeply affected moment of sadness, a melancholia, that breathes life into these words. The relationship, again, one of the questions asked in this book, I think, is the relationship between memory and laughter, the relationship between laughter and absence, and perhaps deductively, the relationship between absence and memory. There are political utterances as well. For example, the poem Black is written in a very strongly racialized context, and it ends again with a blending of the romanticism in these lines with a strong political commentary. Now I'm dark, my love, darker than your black skin. Strolling through the bazaar for a white mask, I find herbs, powders and perfumes that promise to make an empire white in a day. The deep satirical tinge of these lines is unmistakable. In another poem, there's a certain satirical positioning that the voice assumes in relation to the obsessive compulsive protest acts in the city of Kolkata, and how these acts produce a certain urban cliché of Calcutta as the city of protest. So there's a deeply fraught politics at work here. There are political utterances, but there's also an indifference to a certain kind of programmatic politics of noise making. But having said that, these are not apolitical poems by any stretch of imagination. I would like to end this very brief and somewhat disjointed discussion, which is just my way of trying to think about this book, with the last poem, and it's titled Sliding. There's another poem in this book called Drifting, and these are various images of movement, as it were, in the body of language itself. And it's this animation of language that gives it a certain vocalization, a certain quality which is invocatory. But on the other hand, there's also an acknowledgement of this dead body of language, a corpse of memory, as the poet says at one particular point in this book, but also a corpse of language. To end with the ending, let's look at the way the book ends. Our bodies, translucent, vulnerable, sliced, sliding, yet invisible, like the sunset beneath hair and leaves. Night after night after night, the mask falls away from the flesh, and the body falls away from meaning, until all that is visceral, like the sound of flesh on glass, is rendered into the rhythm of slippery feet. The dead too fall away into the precipice of desire. It's a beautiful section, which I think clarifies the point I was trying to make, that these are poems of observation that do not restrict themselves to culture specificity, but go beyond that in a daring, albeit arbitrary, but deeply introspective voice of universal formalizations, as it were. The sound of flesh on glass is rendered into the rhythm of slippery feet. This is a deeply sensitized bodily voice that perceives affect, as it were. Not only the affectation of the body, but the withdrawal of affect from a body. And it is this body that produces these poems. Finally, I would like to congratulate Deeptesh on this wonderful book, and I wish him all the best for all his future endeavors. Thank you very much for listening.